Finding common ground amid differences, the EU and ASEAN agreed to deepen ties at their first ever summit.
The European Union promising to invest $10 billion in Southeast Asia with the target of eventually achieving a bloc-to-bloc trade pact. Underlying differences and worries clouded the meeting. Europe is concerned about Chinese claims over the South China Sea, which carries 1/3 of global shipping. It also pushed for a tougher stance on Russia's invasion of Ukraine amid differences with ASEAN over climate policies and other issues.
For more insight, let's speak now with David Camroux. He's an honorary senior research fellow at Center of International Studies at Sciences Po, and he's joining us this morning from Paris. Dr. Camroux, it sounds like the summit ended with some gains and disappointment on both sides. How do you view the overall outcome?
I think the overall outcome is an example of enlightened self-interest. I think the important point is in the declaration, the joint statement of the leaders, when they indicated that the European strategy on the Indo Pacific is very much like the ASEAN outlook on the Indo Pacific. And so what we're seeing between Southeast Asia and Europe is a convergence of the interest. In relation to China, neither the Southeast Asian countries nor do the Europeans want to be in a situation which the Americans seem to want, for us to confront China. We don't want to isolate China. Rather, in the text devoted to the South China Sea, it's very much supportive of the ASEAN position on the code of conduct, on the respecting the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. So that's very positive for ASEAN. Another example of the self-interest was over something called in Europe the Global Gateway, which is Europe's, if you like, competitive strategy to the Belt and Road Initiative. And again, this is in Southeast Asia's interest to have a third possibility of financing other than China and the United States. And Europe, in promising this 10 billion at least, is offering that third alternative. So there is that convergence of interest. The Europeans were a little bit disappointed that there wasn't a clearer condemnation of the Russian war in Ukraine, the Russian aggression. The statement talked about majority of ASEAN countries seeing this as being, aggression and disastrous, but it wasn't a unanimous decision. But that wasn't really expected that the ASEAN countries would go further than that. On Myanmar, which was a little bit shoved aside, I felt, the European countries said they would continue to support ASEAN in the application of the 5-point consensus. And this is problematic because it's very clear that the junta in Naypyidaw is not willing to play by the rules of the game with the 5-point consensus, and hasn't even, 18 months later, instituted the first of those points. But I think what we're seeing is that on both sides, what in Southeast Asia people want, political leaders want, what in Europe people and political leaders want, is to live in a multipolar world. Europe is one of those poles, China is another pole, the United States, Southeast Asia. And what we need in that multipolar world is rules of the game, a rules-based order. And I think that was, again, something emphasized in the declarations coming out of the summit.
So more room for optimism than sort of negativity coming out in your eyes on this. Just to get your thoughts on events in Ukraine, Vietnam, Laos and Thailand abstained from a UN vote in October condemning Russia's attempted annexation of regions of Ukraine that it seized since February. Why is it important to the EU to get a strong statement on this from ASEAN?
The West is back. Vladimir Putin has done more for European integration and for the reconsolidation of the West than, since the end of the Cold War. There's nothing like a common adversary to unite people. And so this is the bloodiest war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. It's on Europe's doorstep. And you can see that Europeans are willing to accept millions of migrants, of refugees from Ukraine. They're willing to invest billions into supporting the reconstruction of the economy after the end of the war. So, that is the existential threat for Europeans at the moment, is in Ukraine. And having, at least the approval of ASEAN, would be symbolically important. But I don't think it's, of major significance.
And Dr. ASEAN leaders seem to focus on achieving progress in a trade pact with the EU rather than just receiving what they call help. How feasible do you think a broad-based trade agreement will be in the near term? And what are the major impediments to such a deal, that is?
Well, the major impediments, is to use the jargon, are systemic. The European Commission has the prerogative, has the responsibility for negotiating free trade agreements. It's the European Commission that negotiated the free trade agreements that exist with Singapore and with Vietnam and outside of Southeast Asia with South Korea and Japan. The problem is that the ASEAN Secretariat doesn't have that prerogative, that free trade agreements are the responsibilities of individual ASEAN member states. So what I think the Europeans are more realistically heading towards is negotiating individual free trade agreements with countries like the Philippines, Malaysia, perhaps Thailand, and then consolidating these into some sort of total pact. But at the moment, not only because of this systemic problem, but also the problem of Myanmar, means that a free trade agreement with all of ASEAN would not be ratified by the European Parliament. The issue of the civil war in Myanmar is a very emotional issue in the European Parliament, which is kind of the moral conscience, so to speak, of Europe. So that would make it more difficult. And as you know, Myanmar didn't attend the summit, was excluded from the summit. So the Myanmar issue really has to be dealt with for this relationship to go another step further.
Many thanks for sharing your insight and expertise with us this morning, Dr. Camroux. David Camroux from the Center of International Studies at Sciences Po.